right, welcome to Four Rivers Church, Paducah, Eddyville, Lakes Campus. Thanks for coming, and I've got an exciting series with Presents, second week. Let's just jump right in here. Not long ago, I think about a year ago, maybe we did a series called "What Do You Want From Me?" You guys remember that? Asking, where it was us as a heart cry, asking, God, what do you want from me? What do you expect from me? It occurred to me that a lot of what we talk about God's presence versus his presence or gifts that he gives to us, really, we could flip that question around and ask, what do I want from God? You ever thought about that? What do I really want from God? What do I expect from God? What do I expect him to do? I think what you expect God to do in your life will color how you see what he does. Because the truth is, you read, God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He's going to do what he's going to do, right? That's his nature, is to do what he does, right? He's God, right? But yet, how we see what he does, how we view it, colors what happens in our life. We think about what he does as either bad or good sometimes. And so I want to ask the question, what do you expect from God? What do you expect God to do in your life? Do you expect lots of gifts or presents from him? Right? Is that what you want? Or do you just simply want God? Do you want his presence? Do you expect him to be there? Right? And as I ask myself that question, do I want God's gifts or presents, or do I want God's presence in my life? And I think the answer is yes. I want both. Don't I, right? And the truth is that you don't get his gifts without him being in your life. And his gifts and presence for you is him being present in your life. They're not mutually exclusive. They're not totally separate. And yet, we might focus on one and miss the other, mightn't we? Might we so desire good things from God that we might miss him being there all the time? Or might we misinterpret some of the things he's put in our life as negative to the point that we think God is just not around anymore. He's not present in my life because I don't see his presence, gifts, right? And I think that's what's happened with Naomi at this point in the story. But you know what? Before we get to that, this is Christmas season, and the truth is that that's exactly what God's people did. They were expecting a king, a Messiah. They were waiting thousands of years. They're waiting for the king that would come in, crush their enemies, sweep through with a sword and slash and burn, and take over the place, be in charge, and put them right under him, right? That's what their expectation was this big giant gift. And yet what did God do? Oh, he sent a gift, all right, but it was his presence. He sent himself in their midst. Right? He changed it. He turned it on its head, their expectations. He overturned that. And I think as we look at Naomi's story here, that's what Naomi needs right now. You guys remember at the close of chapter 1, when they're on their way back and they come back into their hometown after being on this self-imposed exile in Moab, and they're in Sin City, so to speak, and they decide to come home after she's lost her husband, he's died, and then her two sons have died and all of that. And then one daughter chooses not to come back, her one daughter-in-law, and the other daughter comes back. Ruth comes with her. And that's the one ray of hope, is that Ruth wants to stick with her. But really, that really means she's responsible for her. So even that is not a blessing in Naomi's eyes. She's alone, and she has this one daughter-in-law to care for, who is, by the way, a Moabite. So she's going to be trouble, There's nothing on the horizon that looks good to Naomi. And she comes back into town and she sees some of the other women that she used to know. And they say, hey, Naomi, sweetheart. Remember, that was her name. Naomi means sweetheart. She goes, don't even call me that. I'm Mara. Mara means bitter, right? They just call me Mara because God's just not around me anymore. Life is bitter. God's abandoned me. That's where she is in her heart right now. She doesn't see anything good. Her expectation of God is very low at this point. Maybe, just maybe, because we find out later in the story, chapters 3 and 4, we find out that she has some land that her dead husband had owned, Elimelech, right? So she is a landowner, but the reality is that women were not allowed to own land at the time. So she has rights to this land, but she's got to get somebody else to legally own it and to farm it and to do it. If she's going to have an income, she has to depend on somebody else. So even the little rays of hope are all clouded, but maybe, just maybe, there might be some good gifts for her if she plays her cards right. That's kind of where she is at that point as chapter 2 starts. Not a great place to be. Have you guys ever been there where you just really you stopped expecting good things from God? I have. I want to tell you that when we get there, the truth is that we need to know God's presence in our lives more than we need to get presents from him, right? We need to know his presence. It's one thing to say, God's everywhere all the time. That's a mental assent. I'm talking about know it. As the guy that married my wife and I, right? It's an old-time preacher. He used to say, he was an evangelist really, right? And he would say, do you know it? And do you know that you know that you know that you know, right? And I don't know how else to say that either. I don't know why he said that every sermon. Because, do you know that you know that you know that Jesus is your Savior? That's what he would say. And that's really what I'm talking about, that we need to know in our knower, right? Deep down, as deep as you can know it, know God's presence. Feel is a good word, but it's not all emotion. It's part emotion, it's part mental, right? It's part physical maybe even, that we are connected with God in his presence so much that it is so real to us that we would never question it. We need that much more than we need gifts from him. Good things are good. I mean, God, he's the giver of good gifts, but we need him, his presence, more. And right now, that's what Naomi needs. Let's hope she gets it, right? Well, so you start off in chapter 2, it says this. It says, now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. All right, so Elimelech is her dead husband, and this is a relative of some kind. Now, we don't know a lot about Boaz from this story, but there is good Jewish tradition and history that we can look on, that some of the rabbis had written stuff down, and they know more than what was put in the Bible. And so some of this is a little clouded, but I think it's fair to say that from the story, Boaz is an elderly man. The rabbis think that he was probably in his 70s, maybe 80 at this point. He would probably... because he was considered wealthy and influential in that society, he probably had several children who were probably grown already. He probably had grandchildren, maybe even great-grandchildren at that point, knowing that. And that most likely because of the setting, he was recently widowed. That was the setting from what follows. We think he was recently widowed. And he may have even, some traditions say that he was traveling to this part of the country even to bury his wife even then. So this was why he actually came back home, right? Most likely he lived in Jerusalem, and he had lands in several places in Bethlehem, and he's coming to tend those lands. His name means something like pillar, and the idea is he's a pillar of the community. He's an upstanding guy. That's who Boaz is, right? It's very interesting. So that's Boaz, and really when you read the chapter 2 is about Boaz. It has Ruth and Naomi in it, but it's really about the qualities that Boaz exhibits. The second verse says, one day Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go out into the harvest fields to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it. So first of all, you notice it says Ruth the Moabite. The author wants to remind us that, by the way, she's a Moabite, and that does affect the story. Just because she married into a good Jewish family, that doesn't mean everybody's going to see her that way, right? So this Moabite girl is asking permission to go and work in the field and pick up leftovers. So let's explain that just for a second. Israel, at the time, the people of Israel had a tradition, which was actually a law that said that to help out the impoverished people among them, which were primarily widows, orphans, and foreigners, anybody that happened to be traveling through the land, to protect them and anybody else that might need help. When we glean or harvest or reap the barley and the wheat in this case, that we're going to let them have some of it. Now, it's not just a gift. They had to work for it. So if you're putting it in a category, it would be much more like workfare, right? They got to work to get it, but it's as much as you can get, right? And what would happen is the reapers would come along, and they're cutting the stalks and stacking them, cutting them and stacking them and carrying them. And the rule was, if if anything fell on the ground, if they cut it and it fell, if they didn't get it and bind it, then you couldn't pick it up. You were not allowed to stop and pick that up. So if you dropped a whole stalk, it's gone. That's for the impoverished people. That's God's way of taking care of them because you missed it. It's your own fault for not getting it, right? Some of the workers, as you can imagine, were so skilled at it, and some of the owners, the field owners, were so skilled at getting their workers to be good at it and not missing anything. You can imagine some fields would not have very much dropped, right? And so in addition to that, the law was that a whole corner of the field was partitioned off and not allowed to be harvested at all, just in case there was nothing on the ground for the impoverished. That's how seriously they took it. So this was law. It was good. But the catch is that Ruth is a Moabite. She's not one of them. She is a stranger, right? But she's got the right to do this. She does, because she's a foreigner. She's half family, but half foreigner. But still, did you notice that Ruth asked permission of Naomi to go and do this, even though she had the right to do it? Now, I wonder why she did that. It's because she's a humble young lady. Now, I should mention that Ruth, we think Ruth is probably in her 40s, right? Late, because of the context of the story, she was probably in her late 30s to 40s. Probably too old to be considered childbearing, and she hadn't had any children, we find out later. But yet, she was not considered one of the maids, right? But still young enough to work. Unfortunately, she was in the class to be too young to be considered a widow, right? A real widow would have been considered older, but then too old to marry again. She was in that tough class. And so she decides she's going to go out and just try to work, which I think is pretty admirable. So Naomi says, all right, my daughter, go ahead. You can almost see that. You almost see the tone that she is, all right, go ahead, whatever. It's probably not going to help, right? So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters. And as it happened, it says, and as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. Now, she didn't know that Boaz, she didn't know it was his field yet, and she didn't even know Boaz or anything like that. And so I think it's very telling that it says, as it happened, as if it were a coincidence. And the reality is that God has designed all of this for Naomi's benefit, because what did Naomi need? Naomi needed to know God's presence in her life again. God is about to show her through the next few chapters of this story, show her that he is very real and very present, very active in her life through the circumstances that might seem like a coincidence to other people. And by the end of the story, Naomi, without a shadow of a doubt, will know that God is present in her life. So as it happened, she found herself in Boaz's field. And while she was there, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you, he said. The Lord bless you, the harvesters replied. I want to point out here that it looks a lot like the fact that Boaz has a relationship with his workers. That though he was upstanding in the community, he didn't use it to be proud and hold his workers down. That this is more than a customary greeting. He was friendly with his workers. And throughout the story, you almost get the feeling that he showed up, even though he's maybe 80 years old, he showed up to work. That he's not just showing up to go, how's it going over there? How's it going? You guys getting all the grain? That's good. Right. No, he showed up to lend a hand and to make sure it's all going well, make sure everybody's okay, and make sure that he's going to get a profit from this. That's why he's doing it, right? But it sure seems like Boaz cares as much about the people as he does about the grain. It does at this point. And then, this next verse says that he notices Ruth. It says, Boaz asked his foreman, who is that young woman over there? It would have been awkward if you said young man. Excuse me. Oh, sorry. All right. He said, who is that young woman over there? Who does she belong to? Now let's skip past the fact that he says belong to. In the original Hebrew, it says, whose woman is that? Right? Like I said before, the sad truth is that women were not legal property owners, and if they were going to have protection and rights, it was going to be under the supervision of a male. And so it was a natural question for him to ask. She's not one of mine. I don't have her on my list of people that I care for, right? Who is caring for her and why is she in my field, right? It's a legitimate question, right? But here's the question: why did he notice Ruth at all? You know what I mean? And I think part of it is that he knew all of his workers, well, which is, considering how much land he probably had, was impressive that he knew them. But also, I think Ruth stood out. And last week, Pastor Brad told you guys, and I think it's true, that Ruth is a hottie. He said that. Brad said that. I would not normally use that word, but since Brad said it, right? I think it's probably true, but I don't think that's why he stood out. She stood out to him, because I think so. If that's the truth, then that colors how we look at later how he reacts to her, and I don't think he reacted to her that way at all. I think she stood out maybe because she was near 40, and most of the women that were gleaning would have been much younger, right, on their way to marrying age, right? So she was older. She was probably dressed a little bit different. She probably still had some of her Moabite style coming over, right? But here's what some of the rabbis think. The Jewish history says that most likely Ruth was more modest than the Jewish women, which is odd because in Moab they would not have been very modest. But what that says to them is that she had fully embraced the Jewish traditions and she held them to a T, meaning that she wore things that covered herself, and then how she picked was different than how the other ladies picked. They would bend over from the waist and pick stuff up, which allowed you to see their ankles perhaps, and where she bent down like a lady and picked everything. And so the rabbis think that that's why he noticed her, is that she was exceptionally modest, and that shocked him, right? So I'm not exactly sure about why, but something about her just drew him and asked that. And so the foreman said, "She is the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters. She has been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes' rest in the shelter." So wait, Ruth came to the foreman and asked permission to gather after the harvesters. Did she have to do that? No, it was her legal right to do that. That's the law of the land. She could just show up at any field and start picking up whatever she found of value. That was the rule. But she came to the foreman and asked permission. And the foreman took note of that. So again, humility and asking permission. There's something different about this Ruth, right? And then the foreman also noticed that unlike some of the other ladies, she had worked straight through with only a little bit of rest. So how she did it was very different from everybody else. So Boaz went over and he said to Ruth, "Listen, my daughter." Now, again, that hints at the age difference there. We'd call her my daughter. Although, at this point, he knows who she is, and she does not know who he is, right? She knows that that she is the daughter-in-law of his dead relative, right? So listen, my daughter. Stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go to any other fields. Stay right behind the young women working in my field. So he had identified her as somebody who was not one of his. Now he wants to make sure she is. He wants to put her under his protection. Because see, later on he's going to tell his guys, don't harass her. As a matter of fact, protect her like you would protect anybody else. See, if a foreign woman would walk up and start gleaning, that was not their responsibility to protect her if a robber came up or something like that. But he's putting Ruth under his protection. It's awfully nice of him. So I think the picture here that we get of Boaz is this is like an uncle, a benevolent uncle to a niece saying, I want to protect you. And then he says, see which part of the field they are harvesting, then follow them. I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly, and when you are thirsty, help yourself to the water they have drawn from the well. So she's even given provisions from the people, his own people right there. It's a lot of generosity and protection from him. Ruth reacts to this, as you might imagine a modest, humble, generous person that Ruth is. Ruth falls at his feet and thanks him. What have I done to deserve such kindness, she asks. I am only a foreigner. See, she still doesn't know that they're related by marriage. And she doesn't understand why she would get this kindness on her. Boaz says, yes, I know, but I also know about everything you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I have heard how you left your father and mother and your own land to live here among complete strangers. So what happened was Ruth's outward expression of her inner choice. Remember, her inner choice was to be present with Naomi, to stick with her, I'm going to stick with you. Your God will be my God, and your people will be my people. Remember that? Chapter 1? That inner choice had an outward expression that came out of Ruth so vibrantly that someone else who had a similar heart could not help but to respond to. Right? There's a kindredness about them that were the things of God. This is not love at first sight, and it's not a chemical romance, as they say. This is not you know what I mean? This is a genuine, I see you for who you are, and I like that. You know, and I'm going to respond to that. And again, he's responding. It does turn out to be a romance later on. Chapter. It's a spoiler alert. Sorry about that. But right now, this is just an older gentleman responding to a younger lady who's doing things the right way. It's astonishing him. So then Boaz actually blesses her. He prays for her. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you have done. The ironic thing about that blessing is later on, the next few chapters, Boaz actually fulfills the blessing himself. He rewards her fully. He becomes her reward. So he wishes good things for her, and then God uses him for that. How often do we pray something for somebody, and then God ends up using us to fulfill that prayer? I think it happens more often than we know if we really looked at it. I know God wants us to do that. It's part of the purpose of prayer, is to draw us into what he's doing. All right, so Ruth responds to him. He says, I hope to continue to please you, sir. She replied, you have comforted me by speaking so kindly to me, even though I am not one of your workers. Now, this is our hint. Not one of your kind of workers is what it really says. And kind of a hint that she does things differently. I know that I'm not like one of your other ladies. It's pretty obvious to them. They've been pointing it out to me that I'm not one of them. But I'm glad you like that, right? So Ruth is aware of that. It's in the second part of this chapter comes to mealtime, and this is another thing that astonishes me about Boaz. It's because he's a man of power and wealth, and you would expect when he sweeps into town that he would go and have lunch with the mayor, right? And he'd have lunch at the Rotary Club, right? But no, he stops, and I get the image that he kind of walked through the fields and watched them glean, and then when it was lunchtime, he said, all right, everybody in. We got lunch, and he sat with them, and it even says he serves them. I don't think he went around and waited all the tables, right? He's 80, right? But he cared for them, and he sat and ate with them. It's the kind of guy Boaz was. So at mealtime, Boaz called to her, come over here and help yourself to some food. You can dip your bread in the sour wine. This, to me, hints at the fact that maybe she didn't feel welcome at the table. After all, she was still a foreigner, and she probably did dress differently, and there was probably a little bit of segregation there. She maybe was off by herself, maybe not expecting to eat. She was probably over there with her sack full of stuff she had grained, just kind of eating that raw, right? And Boaz said, no, come and sit over here. You're one of us here. You get to sit at the table. Think of the welcome that is. She's allowed to be in that kind of presence with them. So she sat with his harvesters, it says, and Boaz gave her some roasted grain to eat. My favorite, roasted grain. It was better than the raw stuff out of the field, okay? So he gave some roasted grain to eat. She ate all she wanted and still have some leftovers. Now, why would he give a young lady a heaping pile of roasted grain? Why would he do that? Well, because he knows her heart already, and he knows why she's there. Why was she there? She was there to provide for herself and for Naomi. And Boaz doesn't just have Ruth's concern in his heart. He's concerned also for Naomi, which is his sister-in-law of some kind by marriage. So he's concerned, and he gives her enough to have leftovers. We see later that she takes that home. So when Ruth went back to work again, Boaz ordered his young men, let her gather grain right among the sheaves without stopping her. So instead of she's got to follow along behind and wait till you guys are done and pick up what's left, she got to be right up in the middle of them. So in other words, when a stalk started to wobble and it might hit the ground, she could catch that thing. All right? So that's an advantage over the other gleaners. Right? So she was given a little leg up there. And then he even says this, and pull out some heads of barley from the bundles and drop them on purpose for her. Okay, let her pick them up and don't give her a hard time, he says. You can hear him. Right? Don't give her a hard time. So that probably hints that they usually, even though it was the law to let people pick up stuff, they probably gave people a hard time sometimes about it, right? But don't give her a hard time. So Boaz makes a special provision for Ruth and Naomi. So Ruth gathered barley, it says, there all day, and she beat out the grain that evening. There was a lot, an entire basket. She carried it back into town and showed it to her mother-in-law. Ruth also gave her the roasted grain that was left over from her meal. So Boaz was right. She took it home, gave it to Naomi. So now remember this. Naomi wasn't expecting much, right? She came back expecting to barely be able to beat out an existence at home. She wasn't expecting much. So Naomi, surprise, God's still with you. God is still with you, Naomi. Your name is not Mara. It's still Naomi. You're still God's sweetheart, even though it didn't feel like it for a time. So she asked Ruth, where did you gather all this grain today? Naomi asked, where did you work? May the Lord bless the one who helped you. She doesn't know it's Boaz yet. So Ruth told her mother-in-law about the man whose field she had worked. She said, the man I worked with today is named Boaz. May the Lord bless him. Naomi told her daughter-in-law, he is showing his kindness to us as well as to your dead husband. That man is one of our closest relatives, one of our family redeemers. Now we'll learn next week what that means, a family redeemer. It's going to be an important role for Boaz to fill, but it's somebody that they need desperately in their life legally to be able to be women and to do what they need to do to live. They need a family redeemer, and God has placed one. So then Ruth said, what's more, Boaz even told me to come back and stay with his harvesters until the end of the harvest is completed. Naomi's happy about that. She says, good, and says, do that, stay with them, stay under his protection. At this point, Naomi and Ruth are starting to realize that God is present in their lives. They had doubted that. It was pretty obvious. But they're starting to realize that God is still present in their life. God has a good plan. He is bringing himself into their lives and other people like him, people like Boaz and other people into their life to be a presence in their life. So the chapter closes with this. It says, so Ruth worked alongside the women in Boaz's fields and gathered grain with them until the end of the barley harvest. Then she continued working with them through the wheat harvest in early summer. And all the while she lived with her mother-in-law. So she stayed and took care of Naomi, and God provided for them in that way. So closing thoughts here, a few things, and we'll wrap up. The first thing we should note is that God's presence is always with us. Now, and I don't just mean this as God is so big that he's everywhere. I'm not talking about panentheism, God is in everything, that tree is full of God and this table is full of God. And I think that's true. You know what I mean? I think God is and everything. He holds everything together. So I think Jesus specifically, it says in Colossians, holds everything together. I think Jesus is between all the molecules. That's what I believe. But I don't think that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that his presence is in us and among us. You understand the difference, what I'm saying? I think for believers, especially with the Holy Spirit dwelling in us, that means something. But I think God is also living and active in the plans around us. He has a plan for us. He's active in that. So God's presence is always with us, no matter how we feel about our circumstances. And I think that's the key phrase there. It's one thing to say, yes, God's presence is always with me, and he's got a plan for me that's good, and things are going to work out, right? There's a lot of verses we could quote for that. It's one thing to say all those things. It's another thing to get in the middle of a terrible circumstance and to forget it here. To know it here, but to forget it here. Because we feel that, don't we? And sometimes our intellect and our feeling battle. They do battle and they war. And most of the time we have to admit our feelings went out, don't they? And we desperately need to know God's presence, to know it so deep in us that when we meet those circumstances that we don't react with, well, God must have abandoned me. And I'm not pointing a finger at you guys because I'll point one right at myself. I can do that as well. We all can do that. So God's presence is always with us, no matter how we feel about our circumstances. Boaz shows us a few things. Boaz shows a few things about loving others with our presence. He's a model for us. One thing that he shows us is when you are with someone, make sure you are really with them. When you're with someone, when you're present, make sure you're really present, right? Don't be there, but not be there. It's so easy to do that, isn't it? It's so easy to be present in the room physically, but just not be there. How do we know that Boaz did that? Well, he loved his workers and spent time with them. When he was there, see, because he couldn't always be there, but when he was there, he invested time in them. He served them at the table and he had conversations. It's pretty plain from the sense of the passage that you don't get to be called Boaz, a pillar of the community, right, without having that kind of a heart. So what do we need to do? We must set aside time in our own heart and mind for others. It's one thing to set aside time in your life, right? Physical time to sit down and be together. It's another to set it aside in your mind and your heart, to put away the troubles of the day and to be there with your spouse or with your kid, right? With your friend, to actually be there. Being there means listening to them, making it about them, doesn't it? Right? I think Boaz was probably pretty good at that. Second thing that Boaz teaches us is that when you can't be with somebody physically, you can still be with them. You can still be present with them even when you're not physically there. How do you do that? How do you pull that off? The reality is that we can't always be physically present with people, but we can make our presence known with people when we're not with them, can't we? You can make yourself be known there. And in this day and age, we have all kinds of technology. We can still be there when we're not there, right? But take all that away, and how do you build into someone else's life that even when you're not there, you're still there for them? How do you do that? I think there's a lot of ways. I think doing that other thing by really being there when you are there, that's a good start. It's a great start, as a matter of fact. But I want to suggest to you something else, because Boaz did this. Boaz set up a system for his workers, right? And especially for Ruth and Naomi, he set up a system of protection and provision that went beyond the physical into the emotional, didn't it? And the spiritual. The care that he provided for Ruth and Naomi in this instance demonstrated to them that he had them in his hand. You guys aren't going to fall. I got you, right? You're mine. You're protected, okay? Not mine in a possessive sense, but mine, and I'm going to protect you. He communicated that by what he did. And then he had to go back to his house, you know? He eventually was going to go. But he provided that for his workers, and especially for Naomi and Ruth in this case. How can we do that? I want to close with a suggestion to you, and it's called powerful praise. And if you've ever heard of this before, powerful praise. I didn't come up with it. A buddy of mine, as far as I know, invented it. I don't know. But there's 3 levels of praise that you can praise people. And I'm not talking about praising God. I'm talking about praising or saying good things, encouraging the people around you, right? That you can build into their life. There are 3 levels of that. One is superficial praise. You can praise somebody superficially. That tie looks great. I mean, that tie looks great. Really just says, you know how to put a tie on. Good job, right? Probably somebody else bought it for you because you're a guy, right? They probably even helped you tie it, right? It's superficial, right? That's fine. It's okay to do that. It's nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't really build into anyone's life, right? It doesn't encourage them to do anything positive. Second level is a little bit better. I would call this positive praise. And that is when you see somebody do something, you go, that was cool when you did that. You did that thing, right? You did that. That's awesome. That was good. I might tell my kids, that was great when you took out the trash. Good job taking the trash out, right? And you put the bag back in. That's awesome. It's a good step. Good job. I might tell my son that. Positive praise, right? You know what's even better than that? Powerful praise. Powerful praise gets at the heart of who the person is and the positive step that they took. So in the case of my kid with the same thing, I might praise them for taking out the trash, but if they did it without me asking them, isn't it awesome to say, hey, I really love that God reminded you and you listened, right? That you remembered to take it out the trash without me having to ask you. The fact that you cared enough about me that you didn't make me tell you again. right? Because now, you see what happened there? We're praising their heart for their heart doing something. Slowly over time as we do that, and it doesn't have to just be with your kids, it could be anybody. If you walk around looking for people's heart coming out and doing things that God has asked them to do, if you walk around doing that and then taking opportunities to praise them for that and to say, I love it when you do that, that's awesome. You do earn the right, by the way, to be able to say, that's not so cool when you do that. Because we don't always do positive things, right? Powerful praise can be on the negative side. You could say you could probably not do that, right? But you earn the right to do that, to really speak into people's lives. We all have this ability. So how can we have presence in people's lives when we're not there? It's to really impact them when we are there. There are certain people in my life that I feel like are watching me all the time. Not in a negative way, although it does keep me out of trouble, right? There are people in my life who I've given the ability to speak into my life and to challenge me when I need it and encourage me when I need it, so that I really do feel like they're with me all the time. And when I do something positive, I can hear them, like the Holy Spirit going, that's great that you did that you thought that you took that step. Does it make sense to everybody? I hope that from this series, as we get right in the middle of it now, and we see the fruit that's going to happen to Ruth and to Naomi and to Boaz in the next couple of chapters, I hope that you can see two things. One is that God's presence is so powerful in our lives. It is. We need to just see it most of the time. We need to realize it and see it and know it for what it is. That's transforming for us to know it. And then second, we can have that ability in other people's lives. We can speak into their life and have presence with them, and they with us in the same kind of way. God wants to use us that way. Let's pray.